What, in your view, is the most valuable idea on the planet right now?
Well, you do ask big questions. Okay, I'll try this. I'm not confident this is the best answer, but it's an okay answer, and it's one I think about a lot. And that is that aging is not inevitable, and it can be, I don't know if defeated is too strong a word. It can be resisted. It can be reduced. And I myself have benefited from some cutting edge therapies, and a lot more needs to be done. I worked with my colleague Kaylin Boston to write some optimal regulations for MiniCircle and Prospero so that they could do their anti-aging therapies more easily in that jurisdiction. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to really change a lot of things in our world and I think it's going to happen when we have effective anti-aging therapies. You're perhaps too young to worry about it. I'm not too young to worry about it. But it's once you realize aging is a disease, you start seeing the tragedy that we lose people to that. And of course people die, but it's not just that. I mean, people become decrepit, they become less able as they get older, and we're losing so much, so much intellectual capital every year because people, their bodies are letting them down. It doesn't have to be that way, people. It's not inevitable. It's maybe natural, but that doesn't mean it's good. Not everything natural is good. So fight aging. We need to do lots of things to make it, from a regulatory point of view, easier to do, and I'm working on that front too. Not everybody's going to be working in that field, but I will say that's a powerful idea, both for people to develop anti-aging therapies and for other people to be receptive to it. It's amazing. Many people, almost like they can't believe it because it'd be too good to be true. Well, it's possible. So don't give up on that. It could save your life. It could save your loved ones. It could save all kinds of people we want to keep around. So that is a powerful idea that I hope more people get used to thinking about, defeating aging.
I think that's an incredibly powerful idea and one I hope we can accelerate as much as we can. And I think Brian Johnson's taking the lead on that.
It's
And
true. He did mini circles therapy, by the way. He actually tried it, and he was very excited about it. I haven't done it myself, but I got to say, I'm kind of interested.
it's amazing. Awesome. Again, an honor to have you here, sir. So I'm wondering what originally sparked your interest in philosophy and law, and were there any formative experiences in your childhood or adolescence that set you on this path?
Wow. I guess I would say if you talk about my path being working with special jurisdictions, or maybe government reform more generally, it was probably because my father worked for the Department of Agriculture. And so he would come home from work day after day, usually kind of frustrated about what had happened at the office. And so he gave me a look at how governments work, or more often don't really work from the inside. So I think that made me realize from a very early age, things don't work as well as they should in government. It's a very important institution, but here's a guy, my father, who knows all about it, and he does not always have positive things to say.
What was your father doing in government? What was his
He worked for he did various things, but I think he mostly in the latter part of his career, when I was getting old enough to understand, he was working on insurance contracts. So the United States government then would ship vast amounts of grain overseas as a way of supporting its allies and also preventing local famines. So he was in charge when a shipment got lost or got infected with fungus. There would be a claim on the insurance, and so he would often have to go to these countries, Egypt, sometimes India, and kind of investigate matters and see to it the government wasn't being bamboozled. And that not only gave me a chance to hear my father talk about the United States government, but he would also see how these other governments worked, which made me realize, wow, as messed up as things might be here at home, it's even worse abroad. So all those conversations with my father really kind of fed my views on government reform.
It's amazing. And I'm not sure how many people get insight like that at such a young age, but that's really incredible. So you have an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and so I'm
Yes.
wondering how studying philosophy sort of prepared you for a career in law and policy.
I guess one thing it helped me do was grapple with really difficult to read texts, long chunks of prose that are not very entertaining. And that's something lawyers have to do all the time. Got me used to that. I liked thinking about abstract ideas, and that's useful in the law. But I'll tell you, I got out of philosophy because I did undergraduate. I also got a master's degree in philosophy because I was thinking of getting a PhD and probably becoming a professor. What else do you do with a PhD in philosophy? Um, and I realized after, I guess it would have been 7 years of it, that it's too abstract. And I had started doing research with a law professor. This was at the University of Southern California. And he was doing some philosophy oriented stuff. So he wanted a philosophy graduate student to help him with his research. And talking with this professor, Michael Shapiro, made me realize, wow, the law has one foot in theory and one foot in practice. And I really liked that. It really appealed to me because I was getting tired of only talking in the abstract. I wanted to actually have an impact on the world. And I saw that the law could let me do that. And also I could get a job with a JD. And so then I went to law school and ended up here being a law professor.
Right, the job market for philosophers is a little tight.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've had a career that sort of spanned academia, policy research, legal consulting, and even did a stint at a law firm, if I'm correct.
A couple of law firms.
Yeah, and so what has been some of the most rewarding sort of aspect working across different sectors?
Hmm. Well, one thing that it's allowed me to do is to tell my students that the career they're pursuing, getting a JD, can open up all kinds of doors to them. As you noted, I've been in law firms. I've done a big firm out here in California, Wilson Sonsini, one of the biggest firms in the country. And then I did a medium-sized firm that did large regulated infrastructure industries in Washington, D.C. And then I went into academia. I took a stint and spent it at a think tank. And then I went back into academia, came here to Chapman where I am. And even now, I'm basically about half the time I'm working for private clients. The university sells my time to these outside clients and it takes away some of my teaching obligations so I can go help them. And it just goes to show what you can do with the JD. And there's many things I didn't do, but even just one guy, I ended up doing about 4 different kinds of jobs. And they all have their charms. They all have their downsides, but it's been very rewarding. Being in the law has worked out well for me.
Really nice to hear. And so, it's remarkable how eclectic a career you've had. And I'm wondering sort of what part of your career led to you sort of or opened up your eyes into realizing that there needs to be reformations in government and incentive alignment within science and technology.
Well, I think I had that in mind when I went into the law. In fact, when I was a philosophy student, I told myself when I went to get the graduate degree, I had 3 questions. One was freedom of will, one was intellectual property, wanted to figure out was it justified, and thirdly was justifying government itself. And I actually developed answers to that to my satisfaction as a graduate student. And you can laugh, and many professional philosophers would laugh, but look, I had those questions, I got my answers, and I kind of felt like, in addition to I'm getting tired of the abstract stuff, I thought, those are the big questions I had. I'm satisfied with the answers I've generated. But one of them was, how do you justify government? And what I concluded was, you mostly don't. It's pretty hard to justify. I ended up, writing a lot about that and coming up with the best answer I could. But I went into the law thinking, I want to get to this problem. I can see there's serious problems with justifying government. It needs to be done better, and I want to get to that. And I wasn't able to do that at first. I had to, pay off my student loans, and it was nice work I did in Silicon Valley, but it wasn't in that direction. And then my second law firm job, I was working for a medium-sized firm in Washington D.C. that did large regulated infrastructure industries, and their main client was railroads. They also had some pipelines and telecom industries. But I was there during the Greenwich Revolution in DC. This would have been about 94. And so our clients, the railroads, they were getting rid of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Now, I tell you, it doesn't happen often in Washington. They get rid of a federal agency. It's probably happened like twice, the Civil Aeronautics Board and then the ICC. And I got drafted to help write some legislation to make that happen. And to me, that was super exciting. I mean, how often do you get to do that? You get to write legislation that gets rid of a federal agency. And so that really inspired me. I really liked that. I felt like, wow, I'm having a hand in these important events and moving in a direction I think policy needs to go. So that was very rewarding. I didn't get to do that much. I did that a little bit, and then I went into academia. Spent a year at the Cato Institute, where again I got to kind of work on government reform. But the thing I discovered at the Cato Institute, and this led to my later work with special jurisdictions, was there's all these people there who had great ideas. I agreed with them. We're a bunch of libertarian, classical liberal types coming up with, I thought, great ideas for how to make government better. Hardly ever making much of an impact on the world. Why? in large part because the reforms we were all seeking were an inch deep and a mile wide, right? It was, we want to change this law for everybody in the United States, for example. That's typically kind of the focus of Cato, was national government. Look, brilliant ideas, but you got to convince everybody in the United States, or at least, everyone who's in power in DC. That's a really big ask. And so my current work on special jurisdictions has changed that orientation. So with special jurisdictions, you can do very deep reforms because it's an inch wide, but you can go a mile deep. And I've discovered that's a way, I love what Cato does, and I'm glad they're there, and I want them to keep doing what they're doing. And once in a while, they do get some wins. But for me personally, I found it's much more effective to go an inch wide and a mile deep. And there I've seen you can really effectuate change. And the way it works, when it does work, is that serves as an example, the success you can have in a small zone as an example for other jurisdictions, and they copy it. And that I've discovered is a very promising path to government reform. So that's pretty much half of my life now, as I help clients do that. And yeah, it's been very gratifying.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned the need to justify government, and I've never quite heard it put like that. I think it's something that sort of we just all accept as being a fact that should exist and shouldn't be questioned as much. I'm hoping we can do a bunch of questioning throughout this, but I wanted to explore your core premise, a proposal that you made in terms of scientific prediction exchanges, and I'm wondering, what was the current intellectual property law failure that caused you to go down that route? What was it that you felt was missing in terms of property law that incentivized that?
I wouldn't say it was a property law or intellectual property law that was a holdup, although I do agree there were laws in the way. I was inspired by Robin Hanson, one of my favorite thinkers and an old friend, who basically pioneered this idea of what he was then, I think initially he called them idea futures, and now prediction markets is the more common term. He's a wonderful thinker, Robert Hanson, so brilliant, so creative. I mean, not just brilliant, but very creative. He comes up with these fantastic ideas. And so as soon as I ran into his idea about idea futures, I just thought, wow, this makes so much sense. We got to do this. We got to do this. And my job as a lawyer, I figured was, he wasn't my client or anything, but what lawyers do in my mind is they solve problems. And so I said, okay, let's do this. Why can't we do this? Why aren't we doing this? And man, did I discover problems, because it's kind of a nightmare in terms of what it tells us about regulatory practices in the United States. Here is the problem. Prediction markets kind of fall between the cracks in that they're not plainly legal, although I have an idea about how to do that. But basically, most people look at them and they go, this isn't a thing that exists. And they want to put it in a box. And they put it in one of three boxes typically. They call it gambling. And if it's gambling, you can see right off the bat that's problematic. Or they say it's commodities futures trading. Now that could be made legal, but man, do you have to jump through a lot of hoops to make your prediction market legal if you go that route. Kalshi, the US-based company, has tried that, and it's worked moderately, I guess, for them, but their regulatory overhead is huge. Or you can call it a securities, the things you trade as securities. So it'd be securities trading. And mostly that problem has not materialized in the United States. In the United States, it's mostly considered either gambling, which is per se illegal, or at least sort of, suspected as illegal, or it's commodities futures trading, in which case it could be legal, but you got to jump through all these regulatory hoops, or else it's not legal. And then there does remain this kind of threat. It could be securities regulated by the SEC in the background. And there's even some other laws that could come into play, what are called state bucket shop laws, which I won't get into, but it just goes to show, you have this new kind of animal shows up and there's no habitat for it, and it's got predators everywhere, and you got poor little mousy prediction markets trying to take off and find its niche. And I just looked at that and thought, wow, this is a mess. And I tried to find ways to make it legal. I even tried to start a market myself once, and I decided I'm just not the guy for that. I have my skills, but being an entrepreneur and starting a whole new business was probably not one of them. So in short, that's the problem. It remains the problem in the United States, is they're not plainly legal. There's plenty of potential kind of regulatory predators out there ready to call them illegal and pounce on them. And it's just basically killed the industry, or almost killed it, stifled it. I can say that. It's kept it from flourishing in the United States. It's a terrible loss. It's a terrible loss, but that's where we are right now.
What was it about sort of science and technology and progress involved in those fields that drove you to to sort of associate a prediction market with a, with sort of thinking that a prediction market would be the optimal environment to promote quicker and sort of accelerated progress in those fields?
I had two motivations. One was those are the things I really cared about. I mean, other people, they trade things on prediction markets like, whether some new movie is going to be a box office hit or who's going to win the next election. I just don't care as much about those. I care about things like our ocean level is going to rise a certain amount by a certain year. That's a determinable question of fact, and it affects a lot of people. So I want to have answers to those questions. They really matter to me and a lot of other people. And another reason, this is a little more calculating, is I thought questions like that were less likely to be regulated. It would be easier to justify them. You're kind of coming into the public debate with a halo on. I want to find the truth about science. And as Kalshi has discovered, if a lot of people are interested in the outcomes of elections, and if that's what you want to find out about, oh, wow, now you're going to get a lot of pushback. You do anything touching on politics, and the politicians get really interested and they get very apprehensive. They don't like it. It's been very clear. Kalshi has had this problem with politicians in the United States, at least, kind of viewing it as, I don't know, demeaning or something, or maybe they really don't want to be predicted, right? Maybe they really don't want people to figure out whether or not they're going to win the next election. I'm not sure what the motives of politicians are. I will say that that sort of stuff really gets them worked up. And of course, if you're trading in claims about kind of relative frivolities, like, box office returns, although that was actually an issue at one point, you're not going to be as convincing when you tell people it's important that we do this. It's not as important. Science is important. I think that's not too controversial.
I don't think so either. And I think what I found so interesting about that is it's one of the few mentions where people have thought of prediction markets and also thought to apply them to something that's pretty fundamental to our world. And I mean, science is what drives progress, and progress is what drives economies, right? And so I think that's so vital. It's unfortunate that a lot of the prediction markets that have taken off, are speculating on news and speculating on things that don't matter as much. And it's sort of akin to gambling, which is unfortunate because I think they're a tool that could serve us in ways that perhaps haven't been unlocked yet. And so sort of you mentioned the legal failure, and I'm wondering what's the legal failure in this context? Is it the fact that, it gets bucketed in these buckets that it shouldn't be in, or?
Well, I think the fundamental problem is the idea that unless it's regulated, it's not legal. I mean, that to me is just a wrong assumption. Instead, the assumption should be the converse. Free people, respecting each other's rights, should be able to trade however they damn well see fit to do. It's none of our business. Of course, I feel that way about gambling too. If you want to go gamble and lose your money, it's your business. What do I care? Although you should distinguish gambling from prediction markets. But the point I'm getting at is kind of the attitude that unless somebody in authority says it's okay, you don't get to do it. No, that's not the presumption we're supposed to live under in this allegedly free country. It should be the converse. Unless you can show me I'm affirmatively violating some law, hurting somebody, I can do this. It's between me and the people I'm transacting with. And I'm afraid so many people now kind of have the reverse assumption. They think if it's not regulated, it has to be suspect. And my take on that is actually, it is regulated. We have rules called the common law. Common law rules, basic property rights, contract rights, tort rules, they do regulate behavior, right? When I walk down the street, I don't, trip people. I don't steal their wallets, not because there's some federal agency about walking down the street politely, because they'll sue me if I maltreat them. And that regulates my behavior. Actually, in my case, I'm not even thinking to trip people or steal their wallets. But the point is, we have these background rules which do regulate behavior, but they do it in a decentralized fashion. It's decentralized regulation. So we do not live, when people talk about, market economies, some people on the left especially, but also some people on the right say, oh, you're talking about, an unregulated market and people will be able to do whatever they want. I'm just incredulous. Do you know anything about the law? Doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. There's definitely rules. It just means there's no body in charge. That's what people don't understand. If they can't point to somebody in charge, they think things aren't being regulated. And it's just ignorant, really ignorant of how the world works. If you've studied any Hayek or any number of social scientists, social behavior is regulated in a decentralized way. And I think prediction markets could be done exactly the same way. But alas, it seems like too many people think if we can't point to somebody in charge, then it's unregulated and dangerous. And that's kind of the fundamental problem, that mindset, which I'm afraid I can't change. But yeah, that is a problem.
Well, I think you definitely continue to be and have been an incredible participant in helping change that. I'm wondering, your choice of terminology and sort of picking the word prediction certificate, which I found really interesting. And I was wondering what you meant or sort of what you think the implications of terminology can be in the legal context at times and how valuable it can be.
But you picked up on the use of that in the, I guess it was the scientific prediction markets. Yeah. Okay, so my solution, remember we go back to, I'm a lawyer, I look at a problem, I want to find a solution for my kind of client here. My client is kind of like this, it's not really a person, but prediction markets. And so my solution was to say, here's how you structure the market. You make it a market, not in contracts. So that's a problem people have made. They frame it in terms of contracts. And of course, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission hears that and they think that's our bailiwick because they deal in futures contracts. But you don't have to do it that way. In fact, I don't think you should. I think it is and could be done this way. Instead, what you trade are coupons, notes, or as I called them in that particular formulation, certificates. It wouldn't actually be a piece of paper, it'd be like a digital certificate, but you could imagine it being on a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper that says this note payable in the event that, let's say this note payable for $1 in the event that, and then you have the claim. Ocean levels rise 50 centimeters by the year 2030. Okay, so there's a claim about the future. It's objective, it's determinable, you can judge it. And if you're holding this coupon in the year 2030 and ocean levels have risen 50 centimeters or more, you can cash it in and get $1. It's worth $1. So that is what we call in the law a note. It's actually a negotiable conditional note, which is not much seen in the law. What you mostly see in the law are negotiable notes, simply negotiable notes, which are not conditional. So it's this coupon payable in the year 2030 for $1, no conditions attached. And that makes it negotiable, meaning I can give it to you and you can walk away with it and you can give it to somebody else and they can walk away with it. And anybody who's holding it in the year 2030 can take it to whatever the bank is that's backing it and give it to them and you'll get $1 back. Those play a very important role in our economy. But those are negotiable, I could call them unconditional notes. We don't usually append the unconditional because it's kind of the default. All I'm saying is let's take that legal infrastructure and do it for conditional notes. So now they're not payable to bearer. That's usually what they say, payable to bearer. So basically, if you were holding it, you get paid. No questions asked. We don't ask how you got it. I mean, hopefully you didn't steal it. But the point is, what you paid for it, if you're holding it at the right time, you get paid. Well, it's a little different with these certificates because they would have these claims printed on them and someone would have to adjudicate whether or not the claim is true or not. But beyond that, everything would work the same. And what does this mean? It means it's not a contract. I teach contract law. Actually, this semester I'm teaching property law, but I've taught contract law. And the elements of a contract are offer, acceptance, consideration. To enter into a contract with somebody, you have to say, I propose this. And they have to say, yes, okay. They have to agree. In the archaic usage, which we don't really use anymore, you would say there's a meeting of the minds. It's disfavored terminology, but you get the idea. You have to have two people, two parties agreeing, and there has to be consideration. Offer, acceptance, and consideration is like the quid pro quo. And that's what the Commodities Futures Trading Commission regulates, contracts. Someone says, I propose that you're going to buy all these bacon bellies in September at this price. I accept your proposal. Now we have a contract. That is not the way a note works. There's no exchange like that with a note. I could be carrying this note payable in the year 2030 for $1 and drop it in the street, and you could take it up. And you can take it in and pay. It was payable to bearer. I dropped it. I was sloppy. It's got no name on it. Doesn't have my name on it. And basically, I drop it. It's like cash. You pick it up. You can take it in. You get the money. No contract between me and you. That is not a contract. So by using certificates for this kind of market, you can say, I think legally, hey, Commodities Futures Trading Commission, you got no say here. This is not a contract. Now, what they'll actually say is, well, functionally, it seems to be working the same. And there's two things to say about that. One, no, it's not. Because an important thing about commodities futures trading is you can lose more money than you put into the market. You can go negative, which is pretty scary. And maybe that should be regulated. I kind of doubt it. But there's more of a case for regulation there than in the kind of market we're talking about here. You're never going to lose more than you stake in this in a futures market, in a idea futures market, a prediction market. And secondly, That's answer one is no, it's not functionally the same Commodities Futures Trading Commission. It kind of looks like some of the stuff you do, but it's fundamentally different because the risks are lower. And two, in the law, it actually makes a difference. You can't say, oh, it's functionally the same, so I get to regulate it. In the law, we actually distinguish between contracts and notes. Courts recognize that distinction. And your jurisdiction, CFTC, is strictly limited to these contracts. You don't get to say, oh, that other thing looks like the thing I regulate, so I get to regulate it too. No, that's not how it works, CFTC. You don't get to say, oh, that's close enough. No, your jurisdiction is bounded by the law. And so there you go. I think if we structured these markets using certificates, coupons, notes, whatever you want to call them, they basically are negotiable conditional notes. They would be outside the jurisdiction of the CFTC. They would also, by the way, not be gambling or securities. And we could go to town with it. We could make it legal. You could set it up and start doing it tomorrow. Now, that's kind of what I wanted to do. It turns out, there's still risk. You have to worry about being sued. You have to worry about an aggressive CFTC or SEC or both of them, and also local attorney generals coming after you for gambling. You would still face a risk of suit, even if you're in the clear. I wasn't ready to take on that risk, and I also wasn't the guy to set up a business, but there's another way to do it through special jurisdictions, but I think that's a point for further in our conversation.
Right. So sort of what I was trying to get at is the fact that, so it does mean that definitional bounds are critical from both a legal and conceptual standpoint. So I'm wondering, sort of in your view, what types of discoveries or innovations would not be suitable for trading on a scientific prediction exchange?
What kind of claims wouldn't be suitable?
Yeah, what kind of claims of discoveries?
Oh, well, really strategically, what I'd love to do is kind of start with the hard sciences where there's no doubt, something like, is fusion power going to be sustainable by, a given date? Stuff where no one can doubt, that's purely science. But, really, once you get it up and running, I think it'd be predictable and good to see the bounds of science start expanding. I mean, really, the humane sciences cover a lot of stuff. Political science does cover election outcomes. I wouldn't want to start with that. But the idea would be to start with the hard science where everyone says you're wearing a halo, capital S science. No one cares about, whether or not you're going to find some subparticle or fusion. I mean, some people care, but they're all geeks. And then once you get it up and running, then you slowly extend the boundaries. And lo and behold, you look up in 5 years and, hey, what the heck? That science market is trading election futures. Well, they're not futures, actually. Claims about elections and box office returns. Well, that's the economic science. I'm moving a little too clever here, but I could actually see it evolving that way. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I guess the answer would be the bounds of science are commodious. It covers a lot of ground. It should. The real question is it a claim of fact that is objectively determinable? And that's not true of everything, right? You wouldn't have a claim, are humans intrinsically good or evil? That would not be the kind of claim you'd trade. But you definitely would have things like, our ocean level is going to rise 50 centimeters by the year, 2030. And you could have things like, will the box office returns on the latest Tom Cruise movie exceed 20 million in the first week, whatever numbers you need to put in there. And elections are political science. You could have those in there too, as long as it's objectively determinable. That's important. That's the important thing about it.
Yeah, and I think, and it's also super useful for risk assessment and sort of distributing that risk assessment amongst, just common citizen. So
Yeah.
it's super important from both angles. And so I'm wondering, sort of, you contend that anti-gambling statutes should not constrain these markets, and I'm wondering, sort of, because they involve skill-based trading. So I'm wondering, you might approach an aggressive prosecutor who is to use that.
Yeah, well, I have to admit there's a couple of problems with the argument. No argument in the law is like knocked down, sure, typically. But the basic argument, you alluded to it, let's just make sure your listeners are on board with it. Gambling traditionally is defined as a game of chance, which means, to parse it out a little more, chance predominates over skill in determining who wins the game. So playing craps or roulette, that is definitely a game of chance. It's purely random. Poker's an interesting case where it's mixed. And obviously, some poker players are better than others. It's not just Oh, and respect to you, sir. I'm actually a terrible poker player because I just don't lie very well, don't bluff very well, to put a more charming phrase at work. Um, and so actually, so games like poker are regulated typically on a state by state basis as games of skill. And then there's things like horse racing as well. I've heard many people somewhat convincingly say, oh, yeah, you can read horses. If you know what you're doing, you can go beat the odds. And you're not just some chump who's basically playing roulette with animals. And those are typically regulated under different statutes. So the question would be then, and that's the way prediction markets would be, right? There's usually some element of chance. It does depend, I think, on the question at issue. So if it's a question of hard physics, you might find some genius who has a theory about subatomic particles who can say, look, there's no chance here. I got a theory and I can tell you exactly what the answer is. Things like election returns, I think even there, Nate Silver or whoever your best predictor is going to say, there's a margin of error. Human behavior is intrinsically unpredictable to some degree. And the question is, does skill predominate over chance in determining who wins? And that's true probably of poker. It's probably true of all the claims in a prediction market. So it's not gambling, but it might be regulated as a game of skill in some states. And so there I'd have to say, you got to look at your states and see what they do. The policy concerns about games of skill are quite different. Most states, I'm generalizing grossly here, but it is true. Most states don't regulate games of chance. Basically, you know, um, suppose there's a track meet and they give prizes to the winner. There's some chance involved. You can have a good day, bad day. Someone could trip and fall, but basically, the best person's going to win, and no state is going to say more or less you can't do that. Sweepstakes similarly are regulated on a state by state basis. Well, I shouldn't get into sweepstakes because some of those are pure chance and some have games of skill involved. It's complicated. I can leave it at that. It's complicated. Prediction markets are not gambling in the traditional formulation. They are games of skill, and that gives you a lot more leeway, but you do still have to worry about local state laws. There might be some state that's really picky about games of skill and regulates it. You do have to worry about that still.
Do you think it'd be fair to sort of analogize it to an investor versus a speculator, where one is sort of taking more of a calculated approach and another is trading emotions and sort of volatility?
I think that's a fair comparison, although I kind of believe in the rational market hypothesis. I have some friends who will argue at length that no, you can beat the market if you understand these rules of human psychology, and they might be right, but I can't say they've really ever convinced me. I think there's a lot more to be said that traditional financial speculation is more like gambling than poker. Poker is probably more skill. The person that wins in poker is probably showing more skill than the person who wins in the market. The person who wins in the market is probably they got lucky. Probably.
Probably. So sort of, I'm wondering if the CFTC asserts jurisdiction over prediction markets, how much of an obstacle do you think that would pose to their future viability?
To the prediction market's future liability?
Yeah.
It'd be terrible. It'd be terrible. You've got this bureaucracy that's funded by our tax dollars. They got nothing better to do than go out and sue private parties. If they spend a lot of money on it, are they going to get fired? Nah, they're going to get in the news, which is what basically they want. So they can say, look, we're busy, we're doing stuff, we're protecting the American consumer. It's like the worst enemy you can imagine. And plus, it's not simply that, they get in the news. They probably would see prediction markets as kind of an affront to their authority. How dare they parade around doing this stuff, which I get to regulate? It's an affront to my authority. And I got all these tax dollars I can spend. And I got all these people who can work on my case. And you feel like a little, this is why I didn't do it, because I really love to see prediction markets going, but I'm just one man and I have a family and a house I can't lose, right? I'm not going to go up against the CFTC. It's the Godzilla, right? And I'm an ant against them. It's not a fair fight. Not a fair fight. And even if they lose, I'm probably not going to get my attorney's fees. It'd suck up years of my life. I might lose. And even if I win, probably I got to pay my own attorney's fees. And they don't have to pay theirs, or rather, I'm paying their attorney's fees through my taxes, and then I'd have to pay my own attorney's fees. I mean, what kind of fight is that? It's outrageous.
You'd be losing on all dimensions.
Yeah.
So do you think it'd be similar for the SEC to take oversight? It'd be more or less the same as?
I think it'd be worse in a way. The SEC, well, I'm kind of pleased, at least, as between the CFTC and the SEC. Apparently, the SEC is happy to let the CFTC go after this. And the CFTC did approve Kalshi. We can say that. Just like the SEC sometimes, approves the issuance of public securities. They do that. You can jump through hoops and you can get the okay from the SEC. But if you look at, for example, kind of an analogous enterprise, crypto, the SEC quite obviously doesn't much like crypto, and they've made it very difficult for firms that even want to jump through the hoops. Firms have said, okay, we'll jump through the hoops. What are they? And the SEC has really made that difficult. So I don't know. I think it might even be worse with the SEC. Happily, I think there's reasons you could shake off the SEC more easily, because just for reasons that get into the weeds about what kind of instruments you're dealing with. But there's no guarantees. The SEC has a very broad view of its mandate, and just like the CFTC, they have lots of time on their hands. They have our tax dollars to spend in prosecuting innovators. It's not a good outcome if you have the SEC interested in your new product. It's very bad.
So I think one of the proposed adaptations is that you decentralize this and have it be more distributed. So it's sort of open exchange model where you're only targeting the issuers.
Yeah.
Is that
Augur tried that? I don't know where they ended up. I talked with some people at Augur a while ago, and that was kind of their model. We're going to just write the code. We're going to, what they call it, burning the escape hatches, I think what they called it when they released their code, and they said basically, we can't take it back now. It's out in the wild. People can take it and run with it. I don't think it's taken off like wildfire. I'm not even sure that their market is up and running anymore, but they gave that a try. It's a beautiful idea. I don't think anyone's really executed it yet.
So yeah, no, I think Augur's still sort of trying to figure it out. They have sort of launched a couple products for developers, but I don't think anything's taken off like that. A lot of these things are sort of, I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out how to go about doing it. So you've proposed that states could sort of experiment, and we could do this sort of on a state-by-state basis. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, yes. I mean, of course, the problem then is if you had it legalized, it definitely could do that. But say you had it legalized in, to pick a state, Texas. Well, the people in Louisiana might not be able to trade. Texas is a pretty big state, so maybe that would be enough to have a thick market. But one problem we've seen time and again with these prediction markets among enthusiasts like you and me, you think, oh, this is awesome. It's going to take off. Everyone's going to want to do it. But actually, it's not that easy to get a thick market, to get people trading. People are busy. There's many things they can do with their time and their attention. And most people are not interested intrinsically in prediction markets. Maybe they'd go to the market because they care about some particular claim that's being traded, but they're not going to care about science claims. You're run-of-the-mill person, so there just won't be that many people trading. And thin markets just don't work very well. You need to have thick markets. Maybe Texas has enough people in it if it were a Texas legal market, and the claims are the kind of claims that attract some attention. It might work. It might. But I don't see that happening, probably because it's not cost effective. Probably some entrepreneurs have sat down and thought about this, but they'd have to go lobby the legislature, and that itself is expensive. And yeah, it would not be easy. I haven't looked at that in detail. It's just legally speaking, I can tell you in the abstract, yes, in theory, you could have an intrastate market that a state could say is only for Texans. And that would be really, it'd be fine in terms of the law. Whether or not it'd work out economically, I have more doubts about.
So you've been an advocate of federal agencies and the government at large using prediction markets. And I'm wondering sort of what your logic for that is and how you approach that.
Yes, that with the right administration actually could work. And that's a fun way to go about solving this problem is instead of treating the federal government as it is making itself an enemy of prediction markets, it becomes your ally. But why would the federal government want to use in-house government? I actually wrote a paper about this, government prediction markets. So actually I wrote it because I was invited to do so by the I think it was the OMB, which was interested in ideas about government management. And that was an idea about government management because the government has lots of questions of fact that it must resolve. And it probably more so than most institutions has trouble figuring out what the heck is going on out there in the field. And a prediction market could give them a way to get that information from the field to the people in power. I used an example in the paper about, it was hypothetical about a presidential helicopter. You've heard of Air Force One. Well, there's Air Force, something like that, with a helicopter. And so the idea is the executive branch says, we need a new presidential helicopter. We're going to get bids in and we're going to build it. And of course, it's got to have all these fancy features like some kind of, 007 helicopter. And the projects, they're not sure it's going to get done on time and on budget. So they have a claim market. So the president can, at his, or if it's the right person, her desk, can pull up something on her computer screen and see, where is my helicopter? What's the likelihood they're going to have it delivered on the due date of 2032? And she, the president in this hypothetical, could see the price of that claim. And in one little snapshot, instead of having somebody give her a memorandum or have a 10 o'clock meeting and have a bunch of staffers come in and give her the report, she just sees a number on her screen. She goes, oh, what the hell? It just went down to 12 cents from 30 cents a week ago. And now she knows there's a problem. Or she sees it's going up to 85%. She feels good. Hey, I'm going to get my new helicopter on time in a snapshot, just like that. And if you structure the market correctly, people have an incentive to tell the president or whoever is in charge of this program what they need to know because they get paid. And also, if you structure correctly, it's legal. And the idea was, in fact, to make it the way you do it legally is the employees who would be trading on this, it wouldn't probably be open to the general public. It'd just be for government employees, which is a pretty big number of people. So you could have a pretty thick market. You basically give them the money and you say, you got to go spend this. You got to go trade on the market. We want to hear from you. And so, and if you win on the market, you get to take home a nice bonus, right? You actually get to take home the money. So you have an incentive now. And if they lose all the money, they're no worse off, right? It was kind of money they could use on the market or not. So there you go. The idea is other institutions could use this, but the federal government asked me for ideas about management, so I wrote it with them in mind. And it's a huge institution with terrible information problems. And so, yeah, the idea is we could make government run better. It's not the usual kind of government reform I work in, but heck, if that helps government work better, helps it figure out where our tax dollars are going, whether they're going to get things done on time, I'm okay with that.
I think in some sense it cuts out a lot of middle management, right? And it also gives the executive branch an ability to see what employees on the ground are thinking in some sort of aggregated way. I mean, that's a really remarkable use case, and I think one that could save taxpayers a lot of money. So I just want to commend you for that. So just sort of looking down the road at the potential need for statutory and judicial clarity on this, what part of the government, we mentioned the CFTC, we mentioned the SEC, if not both of those, what part of government do you think should take the lead and sort of?
Well, I can think of a few routes forward. Let me think. If I can I'll give you 4 ideas quickly. One is we have the executive branch implement government prediction markets, and that kind of solves a problem in one discrete arena. It doesn't make it available for you and me. I don't work for the government, but it does show it can be done, and it would open the Overton window, right? Next time people talk about prediction markets, well, that's the thing the federal government does. It must be okay. So there's one idea: have the government do it for itself. 2, new legislation. I actually passed, or I'm sorry, passed. I wish I wrote a bill that could be enacted into law, and it would make scientific prediction markets legal. I think there's a very low possibility of that passing, but you did ask. So there's another idea. Judicial. So we could have a court say, hey, this market is not commodities futures trading, and it's not securities trading, and it's not gambling. But for that, you'd have to do, and this is kind of my 4th idea, you'd have to have someone like do an Uber, someone with the financial wherewithal and the huevos, to use a gender neutral term. Huevos is a gender neutral term. You think about it. You'd have to have the huevos to do this. And I guess I got to admit I didn't, because I didn't have the financial assets. Having financial assets kind of makes you gutsy enough to do this. So you need someone like an Uber or an Elon Musk who says, this is infuriating. It's this great idea that's being held back because of these government regulators, and yet it probably would be legal. I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it. And if they come after me, they're going to sue, we're going to litigate, and then the courts will tell us. That's a very risky strategy. But if you did that, it's like, Uber did something like that. They just started up and running, and they got all these fans. They got all the people using it, and they used that to make it legal, right? They got their fans to go lobby City Hall. There's some great stories about how they did that. And something like this maybe could happen. You get an Elon Musk, maybe he figures out a way to integrate this into X. It actually makes total sense because, it's a big platform. It would get eyeballs. It's about things he cares about, that a lot of people care about. And he just says, oh, I'm going to do it. And then he gets all these people excited in this X market. And then maybe the CFTC goes, ah, geez, maybe we don't want to have this fight. Or maybe they go ahead and sue. And Elon says, great, I got all these attorneys here. You got attorneys, I got attorneys. Go at it, people. Let's see what happens. And hopefully the court says, CFTC, back off. You may not like Musk, but what he's doing here is legal. It's negotiable conditional notes regulated under common law. And yeah, you just don't have jurisdiction, CFTC, and then we're golden. And then everybody can do it as long as they follow the same model. So there's 4 ideas. I could give you a 5th that involves special jurisdictions, but again, I feel like that's further in our conversation.
Yes, so I really like that 4th one, because that one, you know, you have somebody who has the money to fight it off for as long as will be required. And it's also one of those things, I mean, you could add reputation systems, and you could have, there's so many interesting things you can begin doing once people feel as if it's okay to start building on top of on this. And so sort of shifting gears a little bit, you've written a really interesting book called Your Next Government: From Nation State to Stateless Nations, sort of exploring the concept of moving beyond traditional nation states and towards more flexible forms of governance, and potentially leading to a stateless nation, which is the sort of long-term hope. I'm wondering, sort of, you describe governments as lumbering bureaucracies, and sort of the fact that they need to move to more agile special jurisdictions. And I'm wondering what specific evidence of the shift you uncovered in your research.
Well, I don't have quantitative evidence for you. This is kind of taking a very high-level view of history. Yeah. Yeah, I characterize them as dinosaurs. It's not the most creative analogy, but I think it's apt. And, you know, dinosaurs are like, our governments that we have now are rather like these big dinosaurs. They're huge, they're kind of scary, they're often violent, they're stomping around, and we're the mammals. There's special jurisdictions anyhow, are the mammals kind of skittering amongst the feet of the dinosaurs. And if things work out as they did with the dinosaurs, the mammals will someday, you know, be ruling. I mean, the dinosaurs didn't go away. They're still around. They're birds. They turned into birds. And now birds are basically, they amuse us, or we use them. We get their eggs, or we eat them instead of them eating us. And the mammals rule. And so that's kind of my arc of history view, is that's a trajectory which could happen. And I'm trying to make it happen with regard to nation states and special jurisdictions. And it's not like I have particular animosity for nation states in particular. What I'm really critical of are coercive political structures, which basically that's what states are. They rely on coercion. And to me, coercion is kind of a presumed bad. If you see someone pushing somebody else around, hitting them, shooting them, killing them, enslaving them, jailing them, I want to know why that's happening. And unless there's a good reason for it, I think it's something they shouldn't be doing. I'd prefer to have governments based on consent. And that's what we can get. That's not guaranteed with special jurisdictions, but that's what we can get from special jurisdictions. So basically, I want to see governance move towards consent. And it's all this stuff's on a spectrum, right? We have some nation states that definitely have more consent built into them. I've lived in America all my life. Well, actually, I've lived abroad a little bit, but the point is, I'm here now, and it's better than most governments. It needs some improvement. As I say, I love and fear my country. You can definitely do worse in the United States, and most countries probably do, but we can do so much better. And the way we make it better is we make it more rich in consent. It's not a binary, you consent or you don't. It's kind of on a spectrum, and I want us to head towards consent. More consent-rich society is what I'm after, and I think special jurisdictions can help us get there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so you present a World Bank study sort of arguing that the rule of law represents over half of the world's wealth. I found that really interesting. Can you explain what that means in some fundamental sense?
I think it was actually like 44%. It was less than half, but it was by far the largest single component of the wealth of the world. Yeah, this book the World Bank wrote called Where is the Wealth of the World, I think it's called. And they went out and exhaustively surveyed all these potential sources of wealth. And I think most people, well, I can only speak for myself, going into it, I thought, you know, well, it's going to be, I guess it'll be stuff, right? It'll be like, you know, certificates, stock certificates, or jewelry, or real estate. Yeah, probably real estate. That's where most of the wealth is now. It's really actually a pretty small percentage of the world's wealth. Oh, well, then it's like, I don't know, natural resources like oil fields. No, still a pretty small according to the World Bank, source of the world's wealth. And they ended up with this huge number, bigger by far than anything else. I think it was like 44% of the world's wealth is in the rule of law. And that's a puzzler. You can see you're kind of like, what? And I was like that too. And so basically, the way I illustrate it, because when you think about it, it does make sense. It's rather like health. The rule of law is like the health of a polity. And as we say of health, if you don't have your health, nothing else matters, right? All the wealth in the world is of no use to you if you're in constant pain and, unable to enjoy life. Without health, nothing else really matters. And without the rule of law, all this other nice stuff that could be a source of enjoyment or investment returns doesn't matter. I mean, the story I tell is, imagine we had something like a neutron bomb. In the Cold War, they invented a neutron bomb. So if the Soviets were invading West Germany, they'd explode this neutron bomb in the air above the tanks, and it wouldn't disturb the hair on anybody's head, but would kill all those soldiers in the tanks because of this intense burst of radiation. So imagine we had something like that did that to the law, and you explode this anti-law bomb above New York City, then it just wipes out the law. Now, New York City is chock full of valuable assets, right? Diamonds and fancy apartments and mink coats and real estate. All that stuff, the value goes to zero as soon as you don't have the law, right? You can't protect your wealth. You got to move. You got to leave. It'd be a wasteland, right? Your fancy condo on Central Park. You can't keep anybody from invading it and stealing your stuff. You can't protect yourself. You gotta leave. It's a wasteland. So without the rule of law, nothing else matters, really. You can't have any other wealth. And with it, you can turn a wasteland into, I don't know if I'd say a paradise, but a very wealthy place. Like, look at Dubai's International Financial Center. I mean, it's not a paradise, but it was pretty much a desert wasteland until they changed the laws. And they said, we're going to bring in some common law principles. We're going to protect contracts. We'll let you earn interest on the loans you make if you're a financial institution here. And look what happened. The skyscrapers went up, and now there's people there every day making millions of dollars. And you can tell that story over and over again. Singapore was a swamp, and now it's one of the most wealthy places on the globe. And that's all because of, well, not all because of the rule of law, because you had to have people come in and do things. I don't want to take anything away from, the people who do the hard work. But without the rule of law, none of that would have happened. So that's how you end up with the rule of law being so important to the wealth of the world.
Are there ways in which it can be counterproductive? So there's this issue of sort of compounding laws, and can that be an issue too?
That's an interesting question. Well, if we use the analogy with health, I don't think so. But then we're just kind of arguing our way out of your question with semantics. We could say, well, by rule of law, I mean the law works. It's not simply the number of rules. And I guess I think that's fair. I would say the rule of law is not simply, can you count a bunch of rules? It's, do they work? And in fact, you could say, and the founders did say this, having too many rules is counterproductive to the rule of law. They didn't quite put it that way, but I did find and quote this in a video I made once. I think it was Hamilton was pointing out that in a government where there's too many rules, basically you don't have the rule of law because no one can figure out what the rules are. That's the world we live in, my friend. It really is. If you're trying to look at me, I wanted to start a prediction market, and I ended up having to write several papers just to figure out what the rules were, right? I wasn't able to proceed. And most people don't even make it that far. They go, oh my gosh, there's all these rules. I stop. And I actually pushed forward. I'm going to figure out what these rules are and how they apply, which was an immense amount of labor. And at the end of it, I decided it's too unpredictable. I don't know if the SEC is going to sue me, the CFTC is going to sue me, if they'll both sue me, if a state AG is going to come after me. Is that because there's a want of rules? No, there's plenty of rules, but that's not the rule of law. So I guess I'd say that you can't have too much health. So you can't really have too much rule of law, but you can definitely have too many rules, but that's not the rule of law.
Yeah, I think we probably have one too many rules now. Need to get rid of a bunch. And so you described sort of special jurisdictions as more of a revolution from the inside out than an imposed shift. And I'm wondering what examples you found of governments actually willing to choose to enable this transformation.
Oh, well, that's everywhere. I mean, so many examples. I actually describe it as a revolution happening from the inside out and the bottom up worldwide. And so basically what we have are governments that decide for their own reasons, good reasons, but their own reasons to establish special jurisdictions. So why do they do that? because it somehow benefits them. So I'll just use an example from the United States. Most people don't realize it, but we have lots of special jurisdictions in the United States in the form of what are called foreign trade zones. And these are at ports of entry to the United States, often ocean ports, but also airports can be a port of entry for the United States. And in these foreign trade zones, basically, there are no customs and duties. A way to say it is they are outside of the customs and duties territory of the United States. So there's a couple of them not far from where I'm sitting here right now, over in the Port of Long Beach and the Port of San Pedro, over in LA County. I'm in Orange County, California. And in both of those places, you bring in a big cargo ship from, say, China, and it's full of, say, bicycles, and you pull into the port. Now, anywhere else, if you were not in a foreign trade zone, you'd have to pay customs and duties on these imports when you bring it into the United States, but not in a foreign trade zone. There, you can bring it into the port, you can offload the bicycles, you could maybe, add some tassels to the handlebars and little bells to the handlebars. You could add some value. Still don't have to pay customs and duties. You could put them back on smaller ships and then send your improved bicycles to maybe Alaska, to Panama, to Costa Rica, and they've never been on US soil. And that one that lands in Alaska is going to land in US soil. And then you'll have to pay customs and duties once it leaves the foreign trade zone there. But the one that goes down to Panama and Costa Rica, those ships, you don't have to pay customs and duties on that, even though, technically speaking, those bicycles came into the United States, were worked on, and were sent out again. Why did the United States set up these foreign trade zones? And by the way, there's over 400 of them. They're in every state of the union. They're actually very popular because it's actually happened back in at the beginning of the Great Depression, when the United States, like so many idiotic countries at the time, put up these huge trade barriers to international trade. And it was killing the United States because they couldn't do international trade. So politicians figured out, oh, geez, Smoot-Hawley has been a disaster. We just cut ourselves off from world markets, and everybody's losing their jobs because they can't engage in foreign trade. So we're going to create these special zones where there you can engage in this foreign commerce, and that's the origin of foreign trade zones. There's many other examples. That's kind of a free port model is a very popular kind of a special jurisdiction, but SEZs generally, or special economic zones, are all over the world. Another example would be China. I mean, not known as the most freedom-loving country, but what happened under the late communist regime after Mao had passed away and Deng Xiaoping was in power, they kind of looked over the fence at Hong Kong, which was by then thriving. And Hong Kong, of course, had the English common law and had the rule of law. And the Chinese communists kind of looked over the fence and said, what's going on over there? Those are basically a bunch of Chinese people. They're talking Chinese, they're ethnically Chinese, they're right here in China, just over the fence, and they're wealthy. And over here in Maoist China, we're starving by the tens of billions, eating grass, eating each other sometimes on some accounts of the so-called Great Leap Forward. And they, not surprisingly, figured out, oh, gee, they're doing something right there with their rules. Let's try something like that over here in Shenzhen. Let's see if that works. And wow, did it work. And then all through China, the other places in China started implementing the similar reforms where they would respect contracts and property rights and allow private enterprise. And so that's a great example of how legal reforms could lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. It's really one of the great success stories of the 20th century, is how special jurisdictions inspired by Hong Kong spread throughout China, improved the standards of living for millions upon millions of people. Yay, special jurisdictions. And that from a communist regime, right? Even they could figure out, we need some kind of property rights, some kind of commerce. And that's just another example. And why do they do it? Well, like I said, they were eating grass. They wanted some of that wealth and prosperity that Hong Kong was enjoying, and they more or less got it.
Yeah. Are there any mistakes that you've sort of studied in the past of the countries have made in setting up special jurisdiction zones?
Oh, yes, that happens a fair amount. And that is not an argument against special jurisdictions in my mind. It's actually kind of a signal of success, because when they fail, remember the inch wide, mile deep model. If it fails, you only failed in one small place, and you learn something about what not to do. And the risks are taken only by the people who invested in that zone. You don't inflict it on your whole population at once. That's not the way to do things. My most recently published paper, in fact, is called Special Jurisdictions as Laboratories of Governance. And basically it talks about how they can help us discover. It's a hard problem, governing. I criticize the government a lot, but I got to tell you, I'm glad it's not my job. It's got to be very, very difficult. Just very, heavy responsibilities these people take on. And figuring out how to manage people has got to be one of the hardest jobs around. So tip of the hat to people who do it well. And they're going to do it wrong sometimes. With a special jurisdiction, you can do it wrong, you screw up, you only hurt a few people who chose that, and you don't replicate that mistake. So what kind of mistakes have been made? Well, here's a few of the mistakes. Some zones have been set up by governments thinking, oh, we want to encourage industry in this particular area, out in the hinterlands, for example. So we're going to create a special zone there. And oh boy, all the business is going to flock there. And then the locals will have jobs, because right now it's kind of economically depressed because it's so far from our trade routes, our rail lines, and our highways. Well, those don't work because it's so far from your trade routes, your rail lines, and your highways. And it turns out, you got to put the special jurisdiction in the correct place. One thing the World Bank has looked at, they've studied many jurisdictions, special jurisdictions, and they've drawn some kind of empirical results from studying many of these zones. And one thing they've determined is the privately designed and managed zones work better. When you have government bureaucrats decide where the zone's going to go and what kind of industries are going to be in that zone, and then they step in and actually run the zone, it just don't work as well. And that's probably because of incentives, right? The government agents, they have incentives, but they're not the same incentives as a private business. If a private business has to decide where the zone is going to be, they're going to look very carefully at access to port facilities and to skilled labor and all the things that'll make the zone a success. A bureaucrat or politician deciding where the zone is going to be is more likely to decide, where do I need votes, right? Where do I have a favor I have to pay to somebody? And that may be good for the politician, but it's not good for the zone. So you can see that's the kind of mistake that a generalization the World Bank has made about mistakes with zones is we need to get the government not totally out of it. We need governments to set these zones up, or rather to make them possible, but don't have the zones planned by the government, designed by the government, run by the government. Basically, the government should kind of set up the framework and then set back and let market forces determine where the zone's going to be, what industries are going to be there, and how the whole thing is run.
Right, right. I'm wondering what got you interested in Honduras and sort of the legislation that was passed there in the special jurisdiction zone.
Well, I can tell you that was, I think, 2014, and I was a law professor, and I was still interested in legal reform. I was writing things like, probably back then I was writing about prediction markets and thinking, oh, it's so hard to make stuff happen. And I learned that in Honduras, they'd passed this law. Back the first version of what became the ZA statute was the Red A statute. I think it's a Región Especial de Desarrollo, Special Development Region. So that was their first iteration of this legislation. And I learned that there was a company, what was it called? It was called Future Cities Development, I think is what it was called. And it was being run by Patri Friedman. Patri Friedman, son of David Friedman, son of Milton Friedman. Now, it turns out I knew Patri, sort of. I actually knew his father pretty well, David Friedman, who was a professor at the University of Chicago when I went to law school there. And I took a class with David Friedman. And it turns out once he had me over to his house for dinner, and Patri was there. And of course, Patri was then probably just this little toddler. He was this little kid, but he actually remembered meeting me. So anyhow, so we had this connection through his father. And I learned that Patri Friedman was working with this Future Cities Development Company, and they had received a memorandum of understanding with the Honduran government. So I contacted Patri and I basically asked him, who do you have doing your legal work? And he said, nobody. And I said, you might need somebody. Can I help? And he said, okay. And so I started working with Patri. And that's when I got started on the Honduran sort of special development regions. Now, the Red A statute crashed and burned, and that company went out of business, but I kept working in Honduras. In fact, I think maybe I can make a claim to have worked longer on this stuff in Honduras than any non-Honduran. The Hondurans obviously it's their legislation. They came up with the idea. They've seen it through from start to finish, or wherever they are now. It's not even finished. But among the outsiders, I got started with the Red statute. That company crashed. I started with another company, and that was a mixture of locals and foreigners. And that company folded. And then finally, I got connected with Prospera, the people running the ZA now. And they brought in a new statute, the ZA statute, which is the one currently in force in Honduras. So you asked how I got started. That's how I got started. Basically, I saw an opportunity. It looked interesting to me. I made a call. I boldly said, maybe I can help you, and it all panned out.
Are there any risks that sort of still remain in its implementation, or no?
Yes. Well, right now in Honduras, the ZA statute's very unpopular. The current administration, the Castro administration, just hates the Zetas, and they have gotten together a whole coalition of mostly left-wing activists and NGOs that just cannot stand the idea of these Zetas. It just goes against so much of what they value. And they have launched a concerted attack against the Zetas. The Castro administration, now reigning in Honduras, is trying to get rid of the Zetas and failing. Because why? Because the statute was written with people like that in mind. It was written, they even amended the Constitution. And you will hear people who are reporting on this, and they'll say, oh, they've revoked the statute. Not quite, actually. They certainly have not. They did two things to get the Zeti statute enforced. They both passed a law and they amended the Constitution. They've not gotten rid of the amendment of the Constitution. And my understanding is even their alleged revocation of the statute was ineffective because they had to do it over 2 legislative sessions, and they didn't do it the second time. The statute says to get rid of this, you have to get rid of it. You have to act over 2 legislative sessions, and somehow they dropped the ball in the second attempt. Furthermore, there are protections that they, at least Prosper Zeta is one. I'm not as sure about Morazan, the other Zeta that's up and running, but Prosper Zeta worked out an agreement with CAMP, which is the government agency that oversees the Zetas. This is before the current Castro administration came into power. Basically, they got a 50-year legal stability agreement, which means for 50 years, I guess now they're down on like 48 years, whatever. For many decades, they can't have their privileges that they enjoy under the statute revoked. So even if the Castro regime did manage to finally get rid of the Zeti statute, even if they amended the Constitution, those agreements would remain in force. And if Honduras, as they've threatened, tried to negate those agreements, they would get dragged into court. In fact, Prosper has threatened it. Well, threatened is too strong a word. They've suggested, Honduras, maybe we should go talk about this because you're going to force us to go litigate in this international forum about our investors' rights. And Honduras is a member of DR-CAFTA, which is an international agreement that protects the investments of American investors in Honduras. And if you violate that treaty, which you are a party to, assets that are held abroad are going to be susceptible to seizure by us if we get a judgment against you. And their claims, Prosper says, up to $10 billion in claims are at stake. So Honduras, if you do bad by Prosper, you could suffer the loss of $10 billion, which if it's in a New York bank account, we're going to be able to get because you signed this treaty, prior administration. So basically, all this was foreseen as a possibility by the people who created the Zeti system. They knew there's a lot of political turmoil in Honduras. That's why they created the Zetas, because they wanted to create the rule of law in Honduras. You can't have the rule of law, all the rules change with every new administration. No one will come and invest. So they said, we need stability for foreign investors. Here's how we do it. We kind of set aside this part of the country and say it's legally stable. That's what they did. And Castro, it's like it's a test of this. It's a use case. Can it survive the Castro regime's, a very unfriendly regime's attacks? If it can, and so far they're holding in there, it's going to end up great for Prospera because they will have shown we've fended off attacks by a very hostile administration. And the next administration will probably be less insane. And I think then people will say, wow, Prosper survived the darkest days, the worst storm. Now we have a friendlier administration, and things are going to look great for Prosper. That's my hope and my prediction.
It is very balanced, very, very balanced. So another one of sort of the ambitious things that you've done over your career, which there are many, is sort of cover seasteading. And wondering, sort of setting aside the technological hurdles involved, what legal or government barriers you see that still stand in the way of seasteading as a movement?
Oh yeah, my involvement with the seasteaders. I love those folks. They're real dreamers. Well, I've helped them. I can't really speak much to the technical side of it, but I have tried to help them with the legal side. And one thing we early on, talked about was I had to disabuse some people. I wasn't the only person doing this, but I was among the people that had to disabuse some of the other people of the idea that, oh, you just sail offshore and you can do whatever you want. And it's just not like that. If you're in international waters, you have to have the flag of some terrestrial sovereign, or else the terrestrial sovereigns out there with their navies or coast guards are going to seize you, right? If the U.S. Coast Guard especially, which has worldwide reach, if it sees a vessel floating around without a flag on it, it thinks it often is, thinks it's, smuggling people or drugs, or illegal fishing. It's doing something it shouldn't be doing. And it's just basically, it's got no protection. U.S. Coast Guard can swoop in and board the vessel and seize it. and, incarcerate everybody on board, certainly can investigate things. And that's what, so some seasteaders had this idea, we're going to escape terrestrial sovereigns, we're going to go offshore and then we would be free. And, I kind of wish that were true, but it's not, it's just not. What you got to do if you go offshore is you got to have the flag of a terrestrial sovereign to protect you against the other terrestrial sovereigns. That's just the way it is. Maybe we can wish it were different. It's not different. That's the way it is. I had to have that hard talk with a few people. And then the question becomes, okay, so we got to get a flag. How do we get a flag? And that's where the real work begins because of a number of reasons. One reason is it turns out there's a lot of regulation of what vessels are allowed in the open ocean. And there's no supranational government that regulates it. It's again an example of this kind of decentralized, actually mostly privatized regulatory regime that works reasonably well. There are some things that happen on the high seas that shouldn't. There's illegal fishing and smuggling and all kinds of bad stuff, but more or less, it works pretty well. And it's very privately run. My friend Joe Quirk, who's president of the Seasteading Institute, has got the book, he tells me, in the works where he can argue basically the way the governance works on the open ocean is functional anarchy. It's mostly private companies and it pretty much works. Vessels out there are regulated. They're not spewing pollution. They're seaworthy. The people sailing them are trained professionals, and it's not because there's some world government making them do it. So anyhow, if you get a seastead out in the open ocean, it's going to be bound by these kind of private rules, this anarchic government, I guess Joe would call it. But here's the problem, seasteads are not like traditional vessels. And to get out there on the open ocean sporting the flag of a terrestrial sovereign, you have to qualify for the flag. Now, if you're a trawler of a conventional design, that's not hard. Or if you're a tanker, a super tanker, we got standards for that. There's inspection or certification societies that will check out your vessel and be able to tell national flagging authorities this is seaworthy or this is not. We don't have that for seasteads. There's no standards. It's a new kind of vessel. So that's a problem. And then you have to have the flag issued. So you're going to have to find a terrestrial sovereign that's willing to put a flag on your seastead if you want to take it out in international waters. And for that to happen, you have to have a certification company look over your vessel and say to the terrestrial sovereign, thumbs up, this one's seaworthy. And you're also going to have insurance. And the insurance company is also going to say, is this thing going to stay afloat? Because I'm not going to give it insurance if it won't. And if you don't have insurance, you can't get the flag. So it's complicated, it turns out. The seasteaders started out with this idea, we're just going to escape terrestrial sovereigns and we'll be free. And it turns out you get a lawyer like me involved. I'm sorry to say, but it is my job. I have to say, turns out there's a bunch of rules, guys, and it's going to take a while to work through this, and it won't be cheap. And that's kind of where the seasteaders are now. It's expensive in the first place to build any kind of vessel. They're designing a new kind of vessel. They've made great progress, but it's a new kind of vessel. It's expensive to design, expensive to build, and then we have all this regulatory stuff to work through. And that's kind of where we are. And they have a cash flow issue. They just don't have a ton of money. If they had a lot more money, the stuff would happen more quickly, but well, they don't. And so a lot of my legal advice is written and they're on the shelf, and we're waiting for a chance to implement it.
Yeah, I think it speaks to sort of the difficulty of taking theory and applying it in reality. Sort of stepping back a little bit, we talked about this and you mentioned this quite a bit. Sort of the value that consent plays as a central role across law, ethics, and economics. And you mentioned that it hasn't featured prominently in political philosophy. And I'm wondering what, in your view, has caused consent to be marginalized?
Not sure I'd say that quite. I mean, I think I was able in my book to find many places where political philosophers care about consent, right? We talk about the consent of the governed. That's a pretty well-known phrase. I guess my criticism would be it hasn't been given enough centrality in political theory. To me, it is the paramount virtue, basically. If you can show that people in this polity have consented to that governance, your work is pretty much done. You do have to show they consented and they weren't under duress, so they weren't, I guess you could intoxicate maybe a whole nation. It's the same standards we have in contract law. Basically, I've taught contract law, and I'll tell you there's great standards there for telling us when we enforce agreement and when we don't. And if someone holds a gun to your head and they make you sign a contract, we don't enforce that agreement. Or if you're blotto intoxicated and you sign a contract, we don't enforce that contract. Beyond that, pretty much we say you're a capable adult. You have to be the age of majority, but you're a capable adult and you sign this contract. There's no duress involved. We're going to bind you to that. And I'm just arguing in my book, we should apply that standard to governments. I never signed the Constitution. As regards a contract, it is not very binding on me. Now, a lot of my libertarian friends would say, as Lysander Spooner did, it's the Constitution of no authority. They say, if I didn't sign it, it's got no authority. I don't think that's correct, actually. I think consent is on a spectrum. And my model is not binary, light switch off on. You have consent like with a contract or you don't, but rather it's a ladder. It's a ladder of consent. And we're climbing out of this kind of murky regime where maybe we kind of consented because we live here and we haven't left yet, to a world where, and it's going to be hard to do on a nationwide basis, but in a special jurisdiction you could, a world where you actually do sign on the dotted line. It Prosperity, you do that. There's a user's agreement. When you move to Prospera, you become a resident, you actually sign on the dotted line, or you don't. You could say, no, this is not for me. I've read this contract. I don't agree with everything here. I'm not going to do it. And you say, fine, you don't have to. No one's forcing you to. But if you're going to live here, you got to agree to these rules and you're going to sign on the dotted line. And so that, I think, is the model for governments everywhere. Going to be hard to do that everywhere, but it's the ideal. It's the gold standard. And the closer we can get, the higher we can climb on this ladder of consent, the more justified. I don't just simply say it's justified or it's not. It's, is it more or less justified than the alternatives? It's progressive movement towards consent. And that's what I think political philosophy misses. Yeah, I just don't think they give consent enough importance. Once you do that, to me, it's like the polar star. It kind of orients all the decisions about how do we reform government, how do we make it better, more just. I say consent's our standard.
Yeah, so you alluded to it in your answer right now. You speak a bit about this hierarchy of types of consent, and I'm wondering how you imagine governance systems changing if that was to become the standard in the future.
Yeah, there's different kind, and I learned this from teaching contract law. There's different levels of consent, different types of consent. You have hypothetical consent, which is you would agree to it if we asked you, and then there's implied consent, which is you didn't actually come out and say you consent, but you didn't say no, so implied that you said yes. And then you have express consent, where you actually, you're asked, will you sign on the dotted line? Yes, I will. So how do I see this implemented? Well, I'll give you an example. First of all, let's take North Korea. Take an example of where you have a government that I don't think can claim much consent of any type. They certainly can't claim implied consent. Why? Because they don't let people leave. So one important reform for governments is let people leave if they don't want to be there. Now, the fact that people stay does not mean you have their implied consent, because they could stay for a number of reasons, right? You could be an American citizen. You're allowed to leave the United States. Although interestingly, the United States is notoriously bad about letting people give up their citizenship, and that's kind of another story. But as far as physically leaving the country, you can do it. And so that makes the argument that if you're living in America, you've impliedly consented to the American government. It makes it stronger, but it's not a perfectly knocked down argument. Why? Because you could be living in America because you can't afford to leave, or you've got a sick mother you have to take care of, or you're just not comfortable going abroad because people abroad have different cultures, different practices, different languages, and you're not ready for that. So the fact you're staying here doesn't prove you've impliedly consented, but you've got a better argument with regard to America than North Korea. So one, a concrete reform, hey, governments, let people leave if they want to. If you do that, then at least you have a stronger argument for implied consent. Also, hypothetical consent. So no one would hypothetically agree to a government that can drag them off to a prison camp and throw them in just because they've criticized the supreme leader. I mean, if you ask somebody in kind of the abstract, what kind of polity do you want to live in? How about this one where if you say something bad about the government, they can throw you in jail forever? Most people, we don't even have to ask them. We know they'd say, no way. So hypothetically, you'd never agree to that. So, hey, governments of the world, why don't you respect fundamental human rights? If you do that, then you have a stronger claim to say, hypothetically, this form of government is justified. So those are some ideas. There's other ones I could roll out, but it's not that hard to kind of work out this exercise. Once you see there's the polar star consent, there's lots of ways to move in that direction. I just want people to see that as a valuable direction to go in.
It's shocking how obvious that is, but still difficult to implement at scale,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. So can you explain a little bit what your argument as to why we should interpret the Constitution as an agreement between parties rather than a special charter is?
Wow, you've done your background research. You have read my book, Your Next Government. And by the way, you mentioned it came out in 2018, but there's an updated audio book version from 2020, I think, that has has a few more stories from the field, because it's not just theory that I write, but actually I go out and do this stuff. So the book talks about practice and theory. Okay, so
I should mention for the audience that the book will be linked down below. It's an incredible read, and it's just amazing.
oh, thank you, sir. That's very kind of you. I hope your readers enjoy it, or listeners if you get the audiobook version, which I narrated. So yeah, why treat the Constitution as a contract? This is an argument. There's a chapter in the book about how we should interpret the Constitution. Well, for a couple of reasons. I guess the primary reason is because it will make it more consensual. I'm not going to pretend the Constitution is a contract. It's not. Lysander Spooner is correct, and no one asked him to sign on the dotted line. Now, Lysander Spooner's response was, therefore, I'm not bound. He wrote a piece of work called The Constitution of Authority, and basically his argument was, I didn't sign it, I'm not bound, end of story. And I respect his boldness. He was a very brave man, and he actually paid the price for his braveness. You should read up on Lysander Spooner, real character, a really admirable character. But I don't agree with him on that count, because I think we can make the Constitution more justified if we kind of treat it as much like a contract as we can. Not because we sign it on the dotted line, but because of reasons like this. When you have a contract and it's offered by a big, powerful corporation, say, like you go to Dollar Rent-A-Car, and they give you this standard form agreement. It's all this fine print, and you don't get to haggle over it. They just slide it across a desk, and you have to sign or not. And they're not going to give you the keys if you don't sign. I've tried. You can try to modify the contract. The person behind the desk will say, I'm sorry, sir, I don't have authority to modify that. You either accept this and we give you the keys, or don't. When you have a situation like that, and then there's a dispute over the contract, a court will interpret the contract in certain ways. It will say, for example, this term is a little ambiguous. We're going to interpret it in favor of the party who, as we say, was adhering to the contract. That's a term of art they use. It basically means the party who was disadvantaged. We say, corporation, you had a lot more power than this individual consumer. Furthermore, you drafted the contract, and this person didn't. So that's actually an interpretive rule. It's called contra proferentum. So it's an interpretive rule. When we have a contract and we're a little unclear what something means, we're going to say, who wrote this? Oh, you wrote it? Well, we're going to interpret it against you because you introduced this ambiguity, and doubtless you did it to benefit you. And there's other contract interpretive rules that come into play. For example, this one of my favorites. Suppose there's a term in the contract, and it's hidden in the fine print on the back, that if you knew about, you would have objected to. And the party offering it knows that. So Dollar Rent-A-Car puts in the fine print on the back, this is a ridiculous example. I'm just using it for effect, but they say something like, if you bring back the car more than 2 hours late, we get your firstborn child. Of course, they never do that. But the point is, they might try. Wahahaha. You signed it. You signed the contract. We get you, and you're late. We get your firstborn child. And what a court's going to say is, apart from child trafficking being a problem, what they're going to say is, look, you knew that was in there. You knew a reasonable person would object to it, and it was in a standard form agreement. So we're not going to enforce that against this poor consumer, because we don't realistically expect they're going to turn the contract over and take out a magnifying glass and read every word. We're going to protect consumers against this kind of abuse. So there's a few examples of how we read contracts when they're offered by big, powerful corporations against consumers. Now let's look at the Constitution. Okay, it's like the most powerful corporation that's ever existed on Earth, right? The United States government. It's got the power to pretty much destroy civilization on Earth. I don't know about all life, but it could pretty much wipe out all civilization on Earth. It's undying. It's immortal, right? Kind of like a vampire. I don't know if we want to say that, but it is. It's massive. It is beyond Godzilla, and I'm like the littlest, tiniest thing. You and me, assuming you're an American, you're living here anyhow. We are the littlest, tiniest things. It's a huge power imbalance. So anytime there is any doubt over how we should read the Constitution, principles of contract law, this is why we should interpret it like a contract, tell us, read it in favor of the individual, protect the individual. And that is not the way courts do it. Usually, in fact, they say, oh, it's the government of the people. We're going to lean its way. And by the way, here's another thing that really irks me. Who is interpreting the Constitution? Agents of the government, employees of the government. Now that is outrageous. Imagine if Dollar Rent-A-Car said, oh, if you have a fight about our contract, it's going to go to arbitration. And the arbitrators are going to be the CFO, COO, and CEO of Dollar Rent-A-Car. There's no government court that would let them do that. And yet those same government courts say, oh, we have here on the docket, the next case is a case against the US federal government. I, federal employee, am going to decide this case. Outrageous. So that's one thing we should get for interpreting the Constitution like a contract is we're not going to let federal employees decide cases against the federal government. And we don't have to. We have arbitral bodies that can do that. Private third-party arbitration firms could easily handle those cases. So part of my argument is that's where all our cases against the federal government should go. And if it's a state case against a state government, it should be going to, again, private arbitration independent of the litigating parties. I think someday we're going to look back and people are going to be appalled that ever we had a system of government where the government got to judge itself. It's just so facially wrong. How can anybody think that's okay? Well, I'm going to try to fix that, but I have a lot of fish to fry. So anyhow, there's a few things that you get out of this idea. Let's treat the Constitution. I'm not going to say it is a contract, but let's make it as much like a contract as we can, because I think it makes it a better government, a more justified form of government.
Yeah, and I think that helps really color how we should view constraints on government power. It's and this sort of leads into your calls around accountability and liability. And I'm wondering how you make a strong case against legal doctrines like sovereign immunity that shield governments from liability. And so for critics who would say this would overly expose well-intentioned public servants, what alternative sort of protections would you propose?
That is an argument made on behalf of governmental immunity, but well, you've read the chapter, many governments do without it. It seems to be peculiarly American, this concern that the government is exempt from liability for its wrongs. And are all those other governments not functioning? No, they seem to work fine. And furthermore, look, if a government agent does harm, somebody has to pay. Somebody has to pay. Why is it more fair for the particular party who happened to feel the blow fall on them that they have to pay it instead of the general taxpayers? It's not like that money's going to come out of the government employee's pocket, right? It's going to come out of tax coffers, which you and I and other taxpayers fund. So all this says is, hey, taxpayers, if you get some benefit out of the government going out there and doing things and sometimes getting things wrong, you should have to pay for it. To me, that's just so obviously just, and the alternative is so obviously unjust. It's fair that when the government tears down the wrong house and the suit is brought, that poor unfortunate innocent person has to eat the cost and the rest of us benefit. It just doesn't make sense. So I think that's a pretty easy argument. I was kind of shocked when I researched that chapter about sovereign immunity, or more generally governmental immunity. I went out and I found, what do other scholars say about this? And almost uniformly from all across the political spectrum, the scholars said this doctrine is made up. It was never part of the common law. United States courts kind of invented it out of whole cloth. It's a little unclear if they were just making honest mistakes or whether it was more calculating, whatever. It's just not part of the common law, is what courts have often claimed. It was just made up. It was made up. And then you look at the policy reasons for it and you go, actually, these arguments are pretty bad. They're very weak. And so I ended up concluding there's just not good argument with many other scholars who've looked at it. There's just not good arguments for governmental immunity. I mean, there are arguments for it, but good arguments that prevail in a reasoned debate of all views, I don't see it. That's where we are, but I hope to change that too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Can you explain a little bit sort of your proposal for so-called citizen courts and how feasible those might be in the United States and perhaps other countries?
Yeah, those I alluded to those earlier. Citizen court would simply be a body set up to adjudicate claims between a citizen and the government. Because right now those claims go to government courts. And to me, on the face of it, this is not the way things should be. We would never let a private corporation do that. And I don't see why the government is any different. In fact, the government is even worse because they have more power than a private corporation. There's nobody standing over the government, right? There's a government standing over the corporation. The government has the power to throw us in jail if we, misjudge what the law is. So it seems to me anytime that we have a claim against the government, it should not go to the government courts. It should go to an independent court. I call these citizen courts. And if we do this the way it's done in private arbitration, the way we would form the panel of judges to decide these cases would work like this. Let's suppose I have a claim against the government. So government, you're violating my constitutional rights. I pick a judge, and that judge is not like my attorney. That judge does take a promise, takes an oath to uphold the law generally, to be objective. The government chooses a judge. And again, that's not an employee of the government. It's someone who says, I'm independent of the government. I promise to do my job. I'm taking an oath. I will judge this objectively. And then those two judges pick a third judge who serves as the chair of the committee. And that's kind of the tiebreaker. Now, probably my judge is going to be very sympathetic to citizens' rights, and probably the government chosen judge is going to be sympathetic to government powers. Those two have to agree on a third judge, so we don't have a tie. We got three judges, and that three judge panel will hear the case. And this is done in private arbitration all the time. If you have two big international corporations and they have a dispute that crosses national boundaries, let's say it's a Spanish company and a German company, they're not going to go to a Spanish court and they're not going to go to a German court because, the parties don't trust each other's national courts. They're going to do it exactly as I described it. Big international corporations have a lot of money on the line and they have smart attorneys and they have done this time and again. They know what works. I'd say let's learn from them and do the same thing in these disputes between citizens and governments. And yeah, that's a citizen court.
Right. Right. And sort of another proposal of yours around ownership and accountability, it relates to a type of special jurisdiction itself. So you've proposed sort of shareholder-owned cities. I mean, I find this
Yeah.
as an alternative model. And I'm wondering if you've seen any examples of this working in the past and how we would apply this in practice.
Oh, I so want to make this happen. But every time I raise it with a client, it hasn't happened yet. But to me, that is kind of like my goal is to have shareholder-owned cities. Okay, so first of all, imagine a corporation owning a city, which isn't that far from reality, right? Prospera is basically a privately owned real estate development company with governance powers, pretty extensive governance powers, and other people that propose private cities, basically corporations, and they are typically corporations, legal persons that own a big chunk of land and write the rules, and you attract people to live there, and that's how you make money. You sell real estate. So that's kind of the setup. But usually those organizations are owned by rich investors, and nothing against rich investors. Bless their hearts. Without their money, none of this stuff would happen. And we need them to invest. Yay! But just like we have privately held corporations and publicly owned corporations, I would like to see a publicly owned corporation own a city. And the model is like a co-op. A co-op is a form of a housing association in which it works like this. You rent an apartment from a corporation. So you live in a high rise. A lot of the fancy high rises on Central Park in New York City are co-ops. You live in an apartment and you rent the apartment from a corporation and you own shares of the corporation. So you're living in the corporation that you own. And I would like to see this scaled up to a city scale. So the idea would be people living in the city would own their city. Now, right now, cities, at least in the United States, I think this is true most places, they are corporations in the sense they're legal persons, right? New York City is a corporation, and you can have a New York City garbage truck owned by New York City, a corporation. But nobody owns shares of New York City. Nobody invests in New York City and then gets paid distributions. It's not a private corporation. It's a special kind of municipal corporation. Well, I'd say let's make them private corporations. And I think we could do it right and it would be great. We'd have the incentives of people lined up. Imagine if you lived in a city and not just, oh, I root for the Yankees, I'm a New Yorker, but you could say, I own a share of this city. And if we have a good year, maybe I'm even paid a distribution. And think of literally the ownership people would feel. You're walking down the street. I'm not sure this will happen in New York City, maybe a smaller city, but you're walking down the street that you own and there's garbage. You might actually pick it up. Think of the pride you'd feel, in your city. You look around, you say, I own this place. And there's fun things you could do. Well, not just fun, but useful things. How about this? Every year that you live in the city, you're vested another share. This is part of the incentive system set up. You're vested another share. And what's the good thing about that? You get somebody who's lived there for 20 years. They have 20 shares and they get more votes in matters of corporate governance. Now, I actually propose double democracy. I wouldn't have everything run simply by shareholders, because then you get an oligarchy where the person who has the most shares pushes around people who don't have other shares. There's more to the story. I would have a corrective vote to prevent abuses of rights. But the point here I want to make is I think it'd be awesome to have someone who's lived there for 20 years really give them more say in the community. Why? Because they know more. They've invested in the city literally and figuratively. And when they say the park should be over there and not over there, and there's a vote because every shareholder gets a vote in matters of corporate governance, I want to know that guy's opinion. He knows more about how the city works than somebody who just came yesterday. And then if people want to buy more shares, we could do that too. You need a new viaduct that goes across the city. It costs a lot of money, but some people would be willing to invest in the city so that they could, fund these projects. And if the city is a success and it generates tax revenue, they could get paid distributions. That's the way corporations work. So there you go. It's kind of just a kind of a model for how you could structure a city. And I think once we have those tools in place, clever people can build cities that really work. Because right now, cities very often don't work. They're quite dysfunctional. They don't make money. They seem to be falling apart in America, and I want to fix that.
There's something, I mean, I don't, I'm sure you seem pretty excited about it, but there's something so exciting about owning a part of your own city and the ways in which that can align incentives. It's sort of exhilarating to think about. You touched on it a bit in your explanation, but I was wondering if you could sort of expand a little bit about this concept that you call double democracy.
Double democracy. So
I think it'd be great to have owners. Can you still hear me? To have owners of cities manage things the way shareholders do of corporations. If you own more shares of Apple Corporation, you get to have more say in who is on the board of directors, for example. I think that's fair because you've invested more money. There's a lot to like in that, but I don't think with regard to polities, that should be the only principle. Because why? Because there's more than property rights at stake. There's human rights at stake. And so double democracy combines one share per vote. So that's what I call a constructive vote. So you have a share, you get a vote. You have two shares, you have two votes. That's the way publicly held corporations and privately held ones are run. But with a polity, I think you also need what I call a corrective vote. And there, it's a one person per vote, but only works to strike down rules or leaders. So the idea is somebody comes into office and they're voted into office by the shareholders. And maybe it's got the flavor of an oligarchy. Or maybe it's the old timers have more votes because we've had this vote vesting thing. But you're a new person, you move to the city, and you have rights too. And every person has the same human rights as anybody else. So you don't get more votes just because you have more money or you've lived there longer. Everyone's human rights deserve equal protection. So everybody gets one vote against something. So a new leader comes in, or a new leader is elected by the shareholders, the rich people, the old timers, and the new person doesn't like dogs. So they outlaw dogs. I'm using a bit of a trivial example, but people love their dogs. You then would subject this leader and or rule to a corrective vote in which every person in the city would have one vote per person, and you could get rid of that person and or the rule. Why would you do this? Well, for a few reasons. One is I think it's just fair. I think it's fair to, especially for rights. I mean, owning a dog is maybe not a fundamental human right, but I use it because it's a thing people would care about. It would get them to the polls. It could be something more serious, like a restriction on free speech rights. But I think it's important that we have that as a corrective. That's the idea. It's a corrective vote. So it's not an oligarchy because we're not talking just about a corporation. And the thing is, my trajectory, I used to be very critical of democracy. I kind of gave up on it for quite a while. I said, oh, democracy, that's two wolves and a lamb deciding what to have for lunch. And then I kind of made my peace with it. I decided, no. Democracy is fine. We just need more of it, or we need more of another type. We need, well, double democracy is what I call it. We need to, double down on democracy. And I got to say, this has not been really tried. There's been some things close to it. There's actually relatively little research and writing about corrective votes, such as the one I'm describing. When I wrote that chapter, I was kind of surprised. It's not an idea that's been used a lot, as far as I could tell. Maybe political scientists could have done better than me, a law professor, but I don't know. It just seemed to me, this is an institution that could work, and it somehow speaks to me, but I cannot prove. I've worked out a game theoretic, proof that this will maximize human utility, but I think it's worth trying. It's worth trying.
All right, so I think it's a really creative take on sort of balancing interests. And sort of you have a proposal for U.S. special economic zones that also seek to enable new spaces for jurisdictional autonomy. And sort of given the U.S. constitutional structure, what reforms or precedents would enable a model like you proposed to take shape?
The U.S. Special Economic Zones. Yes, there's a chapter in my book about that. And the idea is that the federal government would say on federal lands, using the supremacy clause, we're telling states to back off. States, you don't get to regulate as you normally would in this area. Instead, the special regulations of the U.S. SEZ, the United States Special Economic Zone, apply here. And there'd be revenue sharing between the federal government and the states, and hopefully that would make them happy. And there's lots of fallow land in the Western United States in particular that's right now just kind of empty. No one can develop it. It's owned by the federal government. And this is to the chagrin of the states. States have a just complaint that the federal government was supposed to hand over that territory a long time ago. It was part of the conditions of becoming a state, and the federal government has not delivered title to the land. And it just sits there. Much of Nevada is just empty sagebrush. There is an interesting constitutional problem, which I touched upon in the book. It has to do with a clause in the Constitution that mandates basically equal taxation across the United States. But it turns out, as foreign trade zones indicate, that has been violated. And the Supreme Court's kind of signed off on that. Now, the way I read the Constitution, foreign trade zones are actually not constitutional. They exist, and the Supreme Court has said they're okay, and their reasoning to me is a little sophistical. I won't get into it, but anyhow, that the precedent says that's okay. So if that's okay, I think US SEZs would be okay. So we can use the supremacy clause, no doubt about that, to tell the states to back off. And then this tax equality clause apparently is not a barrier. And from there, the problems are basically political. Doesn't mean that they're easy, but they're not constitutional problems. You don't need to litigate something to the Supreme Court. You just have to get the states and the federal government to agree on this. And the idea is you could then have new cities created under different, perhaps more innovative legal regimes, and we could develop some now empty areas, probably in the Western United States, and maybe we'd find some good solutions for governance.
Yeah. And you've sort of also spoken a little bit about legal operating systems that offer another route to decentralization.
Mhm.
Systems like ULEX, the ULEX project. And so
Ah,
I'm
yeah.
wondering what you see as the main advantages of an open source legal operating system.
Yes, ULEX. So ULEX originated for Honduran, is the second of the three Honduran teams I've worked on, because they said, okay, we need a legal system for the ZA. The ZA framework not only allows, but requires the foreign investors to bring in their legal system. And so, okay, Tom, we're going to need your legal guy. We're going to need a bunch of laws. What are we going to do? And formerly, thinkers like Paul Romer had suggested, oh, you just import some rules from some other country. And I saw immediately that was not going to work very well. Why? Because the Hondurans get kind of itchy when you do anything that looks like colonialism. Why? Because they've suffered, the sharp end of the stick on colonialism. I'm kind of surprised that Romer and company don't see that. But you think you're going to take down the Canadian flag and plant it and they're going to salute it? Just no way. It's just politically not going to work. So I thought, okay, we need rules. We can't just bring down some flag and plant it. I wouldn't even want to do that. So what do we do? And so with ULEX, what I did is I went to non-governmental sources of rules, and it turns out there's a bunch of them, and they're excellent rules. They're in fact better than the flagged rules, if you ask me, because they've been written mostly by esteemed judges and lawyers and academics. Things like the American Law Institute's restatements of law, the Uniform Law Commission's Uniform Commercial Codes, various model acts and statutes. And these are all created by non-political bodies, like private charitable organizations, because they want to help usually US states have good laws. If it's a small state like, say, North Dakota, they don't have a lot of legislators, but they do need good laws. And the idea is, well, here, we're giving it to you on a plate. You don't have to use it, but here's like a model rule, which if you use has been vetted by all these experts, and it'll integrate nicely with your neighbors. It's really going to help you. And basically, North Dakota and other states have said, thank you. It's a great idea. And they're right. So I use sources like that to create ULEX. It's this whole body of rules together with some meta rules, and there's some other stuff that go into it. But the chunk of it is basically not something I created. I kind of took my basket to the library and said, ooh, tort rules, restatement second of torts. Now I got a bunch of tort rules. Oh, contract rules, restatement second of contracts from the ALI. So I filled up my basket and put it all together, and that's ULEX. And it's basically the heart of Prospera's legal system in the Roatan Common Law Code. It's also been implemented in the Catawba Digital Economic Zone. The Catawba Indian Nation is a U.S. Tribe, and they have reservation lands in North and South Carolina. And I helped them create the Catawba Digital Economic Zone, which is now up and running. And it has ULEX in its heart, too. I like to analogize ULEX to Linux. So here I'm holding an Android phone, and this is running the most popular operating system in the world. Android is, because this is an operating system, and it's got at its heart there is sorry, not ULEX, a Linux kernel. And so that's what I see ULEX doing. It's like a little kernel of a bigger operating system. It's not a whole government in and of itself. But it's an important part of potential government. It gives you the substantive, and if you want to use them, most people just use the substantive rules, but it does have procedural rules. And so you can plug this into your operating system, and it doesn't do all the work. You still got to do a lot of other stuff, and I've helped build the stuff around it too, but it solves a lot of problems for people who are trying to create governments from scratch. So that's one advantage. It solves a lot of problems. We need contract rules. And I say, here they are. I didn't write them. They come from this trusted source. They're creme de la creme. And basically my clients say, thank you. We get it. That makes sense. And another advantage, and this is what I'm really excited about, what makes this phone valuable is not so much that I can do cool things on the phone itself, it's that I can communicate with other phones. That's what makes it powerful. And so, if you kept it on airplane mode all the time, it would just, you'd be able to play tic-tac-toe, big deal. But when you can get off a plane and interface with other phones, that's when the power kicks in. And that's my vision for ULEX. I want it running in lots of jurisdictions, and they'll be able to communicate with each other because they'll basically be running kind of the same legal system at their hearts. They'll be independent of each other, but they'll be able to like cooperate so much better. And so you mentioned early on Balaji Srinivasan's interesting work on network states, and I kind of see ULEX as working well with that idea. We could have lots of independent polities, but able to cooperate using this kind of common standard. And they're not ruled. It's not a federation. They're not ruled by anybody, but they're able to talk to each other in a way, and that'll make it easier for them to do wonderful things together, just like the internet, when we use our phones, lets us do wonderful things together.
As a programmer, it's just so exciting for me, the idea of having sort of a code base that you can port and serve this legal function. And I think it's also just an incredible platform for sort of legal experimentation of different sorts. And sort of one of the things that I'm wondering is, without tools of criminal law, how viable and scalable systems like ULEX can be.
That's an excellent question. And by the way, I'm glad you see it from the coding point of view. ULEX you can find on GitHub, by the way. Well, I think the version 1.2 of ULEX does have, 1.1 had some criminal code, but I got to say that part is underdeveloped. And I'm actually now working on another project, the Free Society Project. I've been working with them for years. And our strategy there is basically to not quite say it right, but to say it simply is, we're going to buy sovereignty from an existing sovereign. And I'm saying scare quotes, buy sovereignty, because that's not how it works. You actually enter into a treaty of cessation and mutual recognition. You can't buy sovereignty, but you can negotiate with an existing sovereign to say, hey, will you back off this territory and let us be sovereign there? And that will have a criminal justice system. And I've been working now for years. I'm not the lead guy on the criminal side because that's not really my thing. I do more civil law, but we've been working on the criminal side, and it's complicated to do criminal law right. Can you do a jurisdiction without criminal law? I used to think so, but now I'm more skeptical of that. At least if you have a real space jurisdiction, I think you probably do need criminal law, because not everybody is incentivized to act properly, especially people with, kind of criminal intent. They're not incentivized to act properly merely by the threat of financial sanctions or even injunctive relief. Some people are wicked enough, so you got to bring a pretty heavy club down on their heads to get them to straighten up and not hurt people. I'm sad that that's true, but that's human nature, and that's what criminal law gives us, like it or not. So probably we're going to have criminal law or something very much like it, using coercive sanctions to make any kind of real space polity work.
Right. So now sort of shifting a little bit and moving back, and this is a more general question. If you were sort of 30 years younger, and you look very young as is, I should mention,
Thank you.
advise a younger version of yourself in terms of the career path you would follow if you were growing up today?
Wow. By the way, I'm into anti-aging too, and I could talk about special jurisdictions and some anti-aging regulations, but I don't want to get into that. You asked a very interesting question. Well, first thing I'd say is, dude, start playing guitar now. Don't put that off, because you get better as you practice, and it's so much fun. I wish I would have taken it up. I didn't take it up until, well, actually about 30 years ago, when I was about 30 years old. Anyhow, but career-wise, what would I say? Well, of course, the world was a different place 30 years ago. But if I were giving the advice to me, let me clarify. Yeah, am I going back in time 30 years, or am I going to talk to a 30-year-old me now in this world?
30-year-old you now in this
Okay.
world.
In this world, I would say get into special jurisdictions. I mean, I will admit that's my thing. I love it. And everything is, when you got a hammer in your toolkit, everything looks like a nail. But it's so exciting to work in this field. And it was not 30 years ago. There was basically so little going on. I like to think I've helped cultivate this. I started with some friends, a journal, the Journal of Special Jurisdictions. It's starting to grow as an academic field. And more importantly, we got people actually doing it in the real world. And that wasn't happening 30 years ago. It was just I don't even know if there's even a gleam in people's eyes. They'd heard about things like Galt's Gulch, Ayn Rand's fictional account. So kind of the idea was out there, but no one was really realistically doing much. There was some special development projects, but it was all very small and not interesting. Now, though, it's so exciting. You got great idea like Balaji Srinivasan's ideas. You got actually working examples like Prospera, the Catawba Digital Economic Zone. And there's fantastic stuff happening in Africa. Actually, I got an African project I've been working on now for just a few months. It's super exciting. And we're not in the lead. There's some great stuff. The Charter Citizen Institute's doing some great stuff in Africa. It's a booming economy. Well, it depends on the country you're in. The potential in Africa is so fantastic. Oh, it's just wonderful. So yeah, I'd say young person, or at least 30-year-old, which to me is very young. Check out special jurisdictions. If you're an academic, it's so interesting. There's so many interesting questions, which are almost all unaddressed. If you're a working attorney, there's a ton of work. I turn away jobs all the time. There's not enough people doing the kind of work I do. I mean, there's just not, and there's going to be more all the time. But right now, it's a small community. If you're an investor, if you're like a digital nomad, you're a young person who can move around. There's fantastic opportunities to go and live in some of these places and see what it's like and hang out with young people like you. I wish I'd been in Prosper recently. They did a kind of Zulu type pop-up city, and it just seems like they're having so much fun. I'm kind of tied down. I have a toddler at home, and I got to stay close to home right now. But if I were 30 years old and I didn't have kids underfoot, yeah, I would be down in Prospera hanging out with cool young people and going snorkeling and scuba diving and meeting entrepreneurs and maybe working on the legal code, maybe starting up a business. So it's so exciting and fun. It's so much more fun than going to DC and joining some big bureaucracy, whether it's on the private side or public side. I think it's even much more interesting than moving up to the Bay Area and doing yet another startup and writing, another program. Nothing against programmers, but to see a building going up and say, that is happening in part because I helped write the code, the legal code for that. Wow, that's pretty exciting. So that's what I'd say. Get into special jurisdictions. There's going to be lots of opportunities and it's going to be super interesting and fun.
That's incredible advice. So what are some of the sort of principles and values that you've carried along in your life that you think if sort of a lot of young folks today held deeply, we would have a much better future?
Wow, you ask profound questions. Huh. Well, let me think. All right, I'll give you a couple things. And this is what I tell my children and my students too, is that self-discipline is a superpower. And it can be cultivated. It has to be cultivated. It's like a muscle. You have to exercise it. And so for years, I've fasted 1 day a week, and that's my way of kind of cultivating that muscle. And other things too. But I don't have to make a big pitch for self-discipline, but I'll just observe, without it, basically you can't do anything. Nothing, no big scale projects anyhow. You can sit around and watch TV or TikTok or whatever. And with it, although I can't say you can accomplish anything, I mean, that's not the way the universe is built, but it's amazing. I'm maybe not that person, but there are people out there. I try to be like one of these people who you read their life stories and you realize that person was dedicated to this thing and they stuck at it, and what they accomplished, not in a year, not in 2 years, but over the course of their life, over decades. What you can do if you stick at something, it's just amazing. It seems like a superpower. It's not like, Marvel Comics. You don't get to fly around the sky and things happen like that. That's kind of like a metaphor, really. When I watch Marvel Comics type stuff, to me, that's a metaphor for self-discipline. That's like a cartoon version of what really determined, dedicated people can accomplish. So there's one thing. And the other thing I'll say, and this is more personal to me perhaps, but it's something I've been working on my whole life, and that is cultivate empathy. Because the same people like me who are kind of like determined and have life goals are a little self-centered and they kind of forget about the people around them. So I also meditate twice a day, and there's lots of good ways to meditate. For me, it's cultivating empathy. I think about the people in my life and I try to think good things about them, and just to get myself out of myself so I can focus on other people. And yeah, that's what I found really rewarding about the law is when I'm able to help other people. It may sound schmaltzy, but it's true, and somebody comes to you and they have a problem. I'm not saving lives, but they can't solve the problem. They don't have the answer. When I can send them away feeling better about their problems, it's which is a great feeling. What can I say? So there you go. There's a couple. Cultivate self-discipline, and that's an exercise. You don't get it just by sitting around, oh, I'm going to try harder. You know, you got to do stuff that's hard. I think Jordan Peterson says, make your bed every morning. I was talking with a student here in my office yesterday about that, and he reminded me of that, and he says he does that, and I thought that is kind of flippin' brilliant because it's a concrete thing, and you can see it. Like you see it right there, and it's the first thing you do in the day, so it kind of starts your day right. I don't do that myself, but maybe I should. Stuff like that. So think about that. And then I don't know if I can say to everyone, cultivate empathy. I don't think everybody needs that, but I did. So I'd say find the thing that you need to develop and focus on that. It might be empathy. It could be something else.
Well, I thank you very much for sharing that, and I think you're doing God's work. So, as we wrap up, I have one last big picture question, which is something I ask all my guests, and that's, what in your view is the most valuable idea on the planet right now?
Well, you do ask big questions. Okay, I'll try this. I'm not confident this is the best answer, but it's an okay answer, and it's one I think about a lot. And that is that aging is not inevitable, and it can be, I don't know if defeated is too strong a word. It can be resisted. It can be reduced. And I myself have benefited from some cutting edge therapies, and a lot more needs to be done. I worked with my colleague, Kaylin Boston, to write some optimal regulations for MiniCircle and Prospero so that they could do their anti-aging therapies more easily in that jurisdiction. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's going to really change a lot of things in our world and I think it's going to happen when we have effective anti-aging therapies. You're perhaps too young to worry about it. I'm not too young to worry about it. But it's once you realize aging is a disease, you start seeing the tragedy that we lose people to that. And of course people die, but it's not just that. I mean, people become decrepit, they become less able as they get older, and we're losing so much intellectual capital every year because people, their bodies are letting them down. It doesn't have to be that way, people. It's not inevitable. It's maybe natural, but that doesn't mean it's good. Not everything natural is good. So fight aging. We need to do lots of things to make it, from a regulatory point of view, easier to do, and I'm working on that front too. Not everybody's going to be working in that field, but I will say that's a powerful idea, both for people to develop anti-aging therapies and for other people to be receptive to it. It's amazing. Many people are almost like they can't believe it because it'd be too good to be true. Well, it's possible. So don't give up on that. It could save your life. It could save your loved ones. It could save all kinds of people we want to keep around. So that is a powerful idea that I hope more people get used to thinking about, defeating aging.
I think that's an incredibly powerful idea, and one I hope we can accelerate as much as we can. And I think Brian Johnson's taking the lead on that.
It's
And that
true.
makes
He did MiniCircles therapy, by the way. He actually tried it, and he was very excited about it. I haven't done it myself, but I got to say, I'm kind of interested.
it's amazing. And so I just want to say, Professor, this has been tremendously insightful for me, and it's such an honor to have you here and have the opportunity to dig into your amazing work and life. And I want to appreciate you taking the time to share your ideas and your expertise today.
Well, you're very kind. You ask really probing questions, and thank you for letting me speak with you and your listeners.
Thank you, sir.